Hey everyone, I'm here with Alan Fadling. Alan is founder and president of Unhurried Living and also the author of A Non-Anxious Life. Hi Alan, how are you doing?
I'm very well, Mark. It's good to be with you.
Yeah, I'm so glad to have you here. Alan, just kind of tell us briefly what you do, a little bit about yourself.
Yeah, so Unhurried Living, my wife and I founded about 9 years ago. It's an opportunity, it's an umbrella for all the work we do, which includes writing, resource development. So there's that side of who we are. We are coaches. We do a lot of retreat leading. We think that's a container or a mode that is really good for pastors and leaders to have that
Mm-hmm.
disengagement sort of opportunity. And really, at the heart of what we do is we want to talk about the intersection of spiritual formation or soul care and
Mm-hmm.
leadership development. Too often those get separated. It kind of
Yeah.
becomes an either or, but I don't think it should be.
Yeah.
I think it's an integrated reality.
Yeah, that's great. I love that. I love that. Well, I want to ask you one quick little get to know you question before we get into the meat of this conversation. And that is, Alan, what job would you be terrible at?
Yeah, probably the best answer I can give for you would be a major event planner. Like
Oh, okay.
I want to be the guy who meets with individuals or small groups. I don't mind
Hmm.
speaking at the event, but if I've got to
Yeah.
solve all the details, I would go nuts.
Yeah. I am with you 100%. So you're not interested in planning either of the big Republican or Democratic conventions. That's not your deal. And or probably either
No,
your events.
those events would not be good if I were in
Yeah.
charge of planning
Yeah,
them.
yeah, yeah. 100%. 100%. Me too. Me too. I like being in there with the people. That's good. Well,
Yes.
good. Well, so let's talk about anxiety, right? And
Yeah.
so maybe the first question is, so we're going to talk about a non-anxious life, but what are we talking about when we talk about anxiety?
Yeah. I mean, we can talk about anxiety, which for many, they sort of imagine it as something we feel or experience within ourselves. We could also talk about worry, which is a little bit more of the activity that
Mm-hmm.
gets provoked by our feelings of anxiety. But mostly when I'm talking about uh, uh, anxiety or a non anxious life, I'm talking about those habits of worrying, that ruminating, the what I do when anxiety rises up in my thoughts and my feelings in my physical self.
Yeah. I just recently saw the movie Inside Out 2. Have you seen that movie?
I have not
Uh,
seen it, but I'm aware that there's a new
yeah.
character.
That's right, anxiety. And this is not a spoiler or anything, but it's interesting how they portray anxiety. And I think it's quite brilliant in a way. Basically, her job is to come up with all kinds of possible scenarios for,
Yes.
the little girl to consider. And then the other emotions, there's a scene where they've been sort of banished from the control room and they're trying to make their way back to the control room and they go through the imagination and they go, oh no, anxiety is using the girl's imagination against her, and so anxiety is on a big screen saying, come on, we need more scenarios, people, come up with more, use your imagination, and so all the little imagination characters are drawing. Anyway, I just thought it's a great way of kind of portraying, yeah, we come up with the worst case scenarios in the worst kind
Yeah.
of anxiety. Maybe
Yeah.
I don't know, flesh that out a little bit in terms of like when we do that, like what's happening. We're coping, we're trying to protect ourselves. That's one of the things the movie talks about too. Say something
Yeah.
about that. Yeah.
Well, I think that image is a very good one for at least my
Hmm.
own experience of anxiety as a leader. One of the
Hmm.
ways it shows up is and at its worst, it's sort of the apocalyptic thinking about the future.
Hmm. Mm.
Doomsday is on the horizon because of this unpleasant surprise or this uncertain circumstance. And so, yeah,
Yeah.
I can end up with these large trees of multi branched possibilities. Now, there's
Hmm.
nothing wrong with planning for the future, and there's nothing wrong with giving some attention to, reflecting on what could happen and how I might respond. But there are times when that overwhelms me. There are times when I've spent hours and days of my life trying to live in the future rather than just think
Hmm.
about the future. And so anxiety, one of the things I say is that anxiety claims to be a wonderful counselor, but it has not been that wonderful a lot of the
Mm-hmm.
time for me.
Yeah, yeah. You had, excuse me, two kind of definitions of anxiety or ways of expressing what anxiety is that I thought were pretty good. One was care minus God, and
Mm.
the other one was misguided concern. Maybe help us understand what you mean by that. What does care minus God mean, and why is it misguided concern?
Yeah. So one of the ways I say this is, I grew up in a family system where the equation was you must frantically worry to prove you care. Uh,
Hmm.
if you're not worried, you
Hmm.
must not care.
Hmm. Interesting.
So now concern, yes. And even in the Greek New Testament, the word that can be translated anxiety can also be translated concern.
Hmm.
So anxiety, what I like to say is that anxiety is what my caring looks like when God's greater caring isn't really very big in the picture.
Yeah.
When
Yeah.
I imagine that my caring is it,
Yeah.
I'm the one who cares the most. And so for me, one of the ways that I bring my anxiety to God is prayerfully to remember this thing that concerns me about a
Hmm.
person or about my work or whatever actually really concerns God. Although God's not
Hmm.
worried about it, God's very concerned for me
Yeah.
and for my
Yeah.
work.
Yeah. That's great. That's great. Um, One of my pet peeves is when I hear a pastor say in a sermon that anxiety is a sin or fear is a sin,
Yeah.
because the Bible says, "Fear not," be anxious for nothing. And if you're being anxious, then you need to repent. And it feels like a tactic. I don't know. What do you think
Yeah.
about that?
Yeah. No, I am with you. I think it just doesn't help is the thing.
Yeah.
Telling
Yeah.
somebody who's anxious that they're now sinning has just increased their anxiety. If your goal was to help them navigate their anxiety, you have not helped them. And
Hmm.
I just don't think when Jesus says, don't worry about your life, I really
Yeah.
don't think the tone of that is knock off the sinning with all that
Hmm.
worry of yours. I think the spirit of what Jesus is saying is something much more like, you really don't need to worry.
Yeah. Yeah.
You're really better cared for than you realize.
Yeah.
You have a good shepherd. Pastors
Yeah.
need to remember this. They
Yeah.
have a good shepherd.
Yeah. Yeah.
So to me, it just doesn't help to categorize anxiety as a sin. If you want to get into the
Yeah.
technicalities, I suppose you can make some cases. But if you want to be a pastor, I don't think it
Hmm.
helps.
Yeah. Yeah. It's like when my kids were little and they had a bad dream and they come to our bedroom and they say, "Mommy, Daddy, I'm scared." We say, "Don't be scared." Well, we're not
Yeah,
telling them, "Shame on you, bad boy. You were scared because you had a bad dream." No, we're saying, "You don't
right.
have to. Mom and Dad are here. You're safe." Right. Right. And
Yeah,
so, anyway, what I love about right when I hear the words "fear not" or "be anxious for nothing," right? God is saying, "You're okay. You're safe with me," right?
yeah,
And that's the beauty. That's the hope. And so that leads us maybe into talking about how do we respond to anxiety when we're experiencing anxiety? Like, what do we do? What's a good, healthy way of coping with that?
yeah. Well, so I love a line from Eugene Peterson's take on the Philippians 4 language about, instead of worrying, pray.
Mm,
And he's got a line in there where he says, "It's a wonderful thing what happens when um, Jesus displaces anxiety at the center of our lives, or his peace."
mm, mm-hmm,
That idea of peace displacing, I like that idea.
mm,
And so
mm-hmm,
when I think of the invitations to cast my cares on the one who
mm-hmm,
cares, what I imagine is God knows my concern. He knows what is causing me fear. or
Yeah.
anxiety. And like the good parent you were just describing yourself to be with a kid having a
Yeah.
nightmare, your first response is not a moral response. Your
Right.
first response is a loving parental.
That's
Well,
right.
where did we learn that? We learn that from
Hmm.
a father whose love for us is just beyond measuring. So, one of the things that I want to say to those like me who have
Hmm.
had a lifelong struggle with anxiety as an operating system, just
Yeah.
basic sort of reality, is that one of the opportunities that Jesus is inviting us to is to recognize God's caring for that which concerns us.
Mm.
Um,
Yeah.
and that, if Jesus is a Prince of Peace, that might really make a difference for me if I'm living my
Mm.
life in communion with him.
Yeah.
What would it be like to just be around a person who's always peaceful?
Right.
That probably
That
is
would
a
rub
good
off
thing.
on you. Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. That might rub off on you. And so, what are some ways that we can lean into that peace and lean away from the anxiety or the anxiousness?
Yeah. So, one of the things that's helped me immensely is to take advantage of just very simple little statements of scripture, like
Hmm.
the famous Psalm 23, the Lord is my shepherd, I shall not want.
Mm-hmm.
So frequently something will happen and I will be unpleasantly surprised. And that's the mild way to put it. My
Mm-hmm.
body goes on alert. My brain goes into full lizard mode. I mean, like I can
Mm.
feel anxiety absolutely overpowering. And there were times when that would paralyze me.
Yeah.
And I came to take on a practice that I remember Dallas Willard talking about, just the simplicity of that image of the shepherd in Psalm 23. And I
Mm.
would literally feeling my chest tighten and my mind freeze and all of the physical and emotional experiences of anxiety. And I would just say in that moment, the Lord is shepherding me now.
Mm-hmm.
And then
Mm-hmm.
I shall not want, I would sometimes say that as this might turn out better than
Yeah.
anxiety is predicting.
Mm.
And after a while, that became a way of entering into peace in the midst of something that had provoked anxiety. And the beautiful
Yeah.
thing was that as that became habit, the wonderful thing about peace is you can be much more creative and strategic about responding to what's made you anxious than you can when you're anxious.
Yeah.
And is at least one way that has helped me a lot.
Yeah. Yeah. Now, uh, uh, my next question is, I'm not pushing back, but I'm trying to flesh that out a little bit, because sometimes people will say, "Hey, just rejoice in the Lord. Rejoice in the Lord always," right? It kind of falls into the stop being anxious kind of mentality. And I was kind of reviewing Peter Scazzera's Emotionally Healthy Spirituality recently. I don't know if you've probably read it.
Yeah,
And he
good
talks
stuff.
about in Christianity, generally speaking, we tend to try to run towards the positive emotions and try to avoid the negative emotions like fear and anger and sadness, and anxiety would fall into that, right? To what extent do we need to feel our anxiety in order to get through it? Does that make sense? Is that what do you think about that?
Absolutely. Yeah. So when I talk about, quoting that line of scripture, I'm not envisioning an avoidance of the unpleasant reality I'm in the middle of.
Hmm.
It's sort of more like changing my perspective on the
Hmm.
situation in which I find myself.
Yeah.
What anxiety does is it tends to create a world where God isn't much involved.
Yeah.
And I need
Uh,
to remember that God's with me. That
yeah.
so when I
Right.
pray, it's not, and in a sense, I pray my anxiety. I don't
Mm.
pray to get rid of my anxiety.
Yeah.
I pray that God would meet me in that which I care. And
Yeah.
maybe another thing that helps me is sometimes I'll ask the question, what does this worry say about what I care about?
Hmm. Hmm.
And how
That's
could I
great.
care about that in the presence of God and not just in the presence of anxiety?
Yeah. Yeah. One of the things that has helped me, and this is maybe along similar lines, is like the 23rd Psalm, but sometimes the Psalms of Lament are
Yeah.
very helpful because it lets me lean into the anxiety for a moment at least, right? Or for those moments that I'm in that psalm and I'm sitting with it quietly, perhaps. And then I can kind of lean back and go, okay, right. Thank you, Lord, for this psalmist, David or whoever, for saying these words that I
Yeah.
really am feeling myself right now. And thank you that you can take these from me. Or I can at least lean on you as I'm feeling these. I mean, that's the beauty of it, I think, right? When we understand I'm not in this alone, whatever this anxiety is that I'm feeling, whatever the situation that I'm worried about, I'm not in it alone. I just know that there have been times in my life when I have been really worried about something, and I think to
Mm,
myself, how do people get through this without someone stronger than them to carry them through it? What's your
absolutely.
experience been with that? How have you experienced
Yeah.
that? Yeah.
Well, I was going to say a version of that for me is I am a journaler. Not everybody
Mm.
is, but
Hmm.
I've been journaling pretty regularly since my 20s. I mean, I have something like 12,000 pages, 8 million words of journaling. It's
Wow.
just, I'm probably
Wow.
obsessive, you know.
Wow. I'm not a journaler. Sometimes I feel bad about myself for that, and I worry that I should be. I'm just kidding.
Yeah,
But
right,
anyway,
right.
that's
I'm
so
not
great.
trying to, I'm not trying to
I,
provoke anxiety, right?
yeah, right.
But one of the things I've learned is I've got to journal with the assumption that no one will ever read this and I can be as honest, gut
Mm,
honest as I want to be. I can talk about what's frightening me, what's worrying me, what makes me feel
hmm.
guilty or shameful, what makes me feel anxious, or what makes me feel hopeless. I mean, I'm writing in some ways, I suppose I'm kind of writing my own Psalms of lament when I
Hmm.
write those passages. And so often what will happen, I can feel it when it happens. I'll write a
Yeah.
sentence or two and I'll go, there it is.
Mm,
That's what's happening in me. But it's
mm.
happening in the presence of God, and God cares,
Yeah.
and I'm not alone in it. So
Yeah.
maybe that's one of the ways that what you just described, how that happens for me.
Yeah. That's beautiful. Um, Now you work with pastors and ministry leaders, and those of us who are pastors and ministry leaders, we get anxious, and we feel it, and and that anxiety, I think, is rooted in a lot of different things. It's rooted in the pressure that we feel that we put on ourselves to be successful, right? I put that in air
Yeah.
quotes. Or the pressure that other people put on us, or just sort of the pressure to be good morally, or to be good at what we do, or anyway. And then, of course, just the pressures and the worries. We're in a very tense sort of political situation in this country right now, and depending on what's going on in your own congregation, that can create a lot of anxiety for
Oh,
yourself and for others. And
yes.
so, just let's talk a little bit about how to navigate anxiety as a ministry leader. Like, what are some of the things that you have experienced, or that you've seen? And yeah, just why don't you bring what you have in terms of your experience with anxiety and ministry leadership?
Yeah. So, for me, I've been in ministry 40 years. About
Mm,
roughly the first half of that was in local church, pastoral roles. The
hmm.
last 20 has been more in a coming alongside pastors to encourage, to support.
Yeah.
And I know from in my own experience of pastoral ministry, one of my big worries, I'll just be frank, do they like me?
Mm,
You know,
yes. Yeah.
does
Right.
this
For
group
sure.
like me? Do they like what I'm doing? Do they appreciate it? And some of that was natural and normal, and some of it was kind of rooted in a great insecurity that I brought to my life and ministry.
Yeah.
And so one of the things I learned over time is I so needed to learn that God was the one who could meet me at that place of insecurity, and a congregation never could. They were never
Yeah.
going to be able to do for me what my soul needed.
Yeah.
I needed to bring that recognition deficit, maybe. I needed to
Hmm.
bring that to God. And that's become a little bit of a paradigm. The way I ask myself the question is, what thirsts of my soul am I bringing to my congregation in hopes that they'll meet me there,
Mm-hmm.
rather than learning to take the thirsts of my soul to God so that God could meet me in those places. And then I could bring abundance to the
Yeah.
community of people entrusted to me. So that's one kind of soul dynamic I've noticed in terms
Yeah.
of my own anxiety and my own, as a leader, as a pastor.
Yeah, yeah. I love what you just said about bringing abundance, which feels like the opposite of anxiety. Anxiety feels like this tightness and this sort of smallness in our chest,
Yeah.
so to speak, right? And abundance is the opposite of that. What does it mean? Say more about what you mean by bringing abundance to our congregations, because that's the non-anxious side of things, maybe.
I think it is. So again, to say it another way,
Hmm.
as a pastor, I was often and have often been tempted to try and find something my soul needs in the congregation or in my
Mm.
work or in my, your air quotes, success,
Yeah,
as though
yeah,
those things could satisfy my soul. And
yeah,
if my identity is rooted in what I do as a pastor and what I say as a pastor and what I accomplish as a pastor and how everybody thinks of me as a pastor, it's a bit of
hmm,
it's a bit of an identity treadmill,
yeah,
and I'll just have to keep running faster and faster, still not quite feeling like it's helping me.
yeah, yeah.
So I think, one of the opportunities for us in whatever leadership roles God's given us is to find how God would meet us in our places of thirst. This image comes from Jesus, John
Hmm.
7. It's the last day of a great festival. He stands before the crowd and says, "Is anybody thirsty?
Mm.
Is anybody thirsty? That one should come to me, and those who believe in me, it will be like rivers of living water flowing from within
Hmm.
them." What I love is
Mm.
bring thirst, and what will flow from that is rivers.
Mm.
And to
That,
me, again, that's been a kind of metaphor. It's been a kind of paradigm. Like where I feel
yeah,
small and narrow and scarce inside of me, how could
yeah,
I bring that to God in a way that could be transformed into abundance that I then bring to my work, to people I care for, or whatever. The
yeah.
last thing I'll say is anxiety
Hmm.
creates a tunnel. And
Mm.
I just am
Hmm.
so constricted. Part of the abundance of peace is the spaciousness
Yeah,
of
yeah,
peace, the
yeah,
ability to see far more than I can see when I'm anxious, the ability to have more
yeah,
options and more perspective. That's another
yeah,
way abundance shows up, I think.
yeah. Um, I'm looking at the questions I had jotted down as I was reading your book, and one of them I can't remember what exactly what you said in the book, but the question that I wrote down is, "How is our anxiety a blessing to others?" All right, and I can't remember if you said something about anxiety being a blessing now, unfortunately, but I'm hoping that we can talk about that. Right? Is there a blessing in bringing our anxiety or in like to our congregation in the midst of challenging times? Perhaps does that ring a
Mm.
bell? I don't know.
Yeah.
Maybe I'm.
No. So here's one thing I would say.
Uh huh.
I think there's a way to be real with the people we care for. There's
Mm-hmm.
that temptation to appear to be problem free,
Yeah.
you
Yeah.
know, to think that what the congregation needs is me and as an example of everything's going great and I
Yeah.
have no troubles. And
Yes.
I think it has, writing this book has given me entree to conversations I couldn't have before, because part of the book is I have wrestled my whole adult life with anxiety. I have
Mm.
needed uh, I've needed encouragement from friends. I've needed
Mm-hmm.
pastoral ministry. I've needed
Mm-hmm.
therapy. At
Mm.
times, I've needed medical assistance
Mm.
within
Mm-hmm.
in that journey. This is real for me. It's not a theoretical book that I've
Mm.
written.
Yeah.
Being able to say that has opened the door to conversations about, oh, me too. And I think
Yeah.
there's a sense in the congregation that, yeah, they don't need you to be so messed up and broken that you can't be of help to them. But maybe
Right.
Henry Nouwen's wounded healer is
Right.
a good metaphor in this in this case.
Hmm.
That peace for me is not just peace because everything's fine. No, peace
Yeah.
for me is a reality I've had to lean into and live into in the midst of
Yeah.
my own very deep concerns and worries.
Yeah. Um, Part of what you're saying, I think, is right. You're saying we don't need to bring all of our anxiety to the congregation because that may or may not be actually good for them. But we do need to bring our anxiety to somebody, so to God, of course. But you talked about friends and therapy and sometimes even medication, or medical responses. Um, but what about I have found that it's been so helpful to me to have people outside of my congregation that
Mm,
I'm in relationship with, friends, right? Friends and mentors and other guides, therapists, right? People who are spiritual
yes.
directors that I can bring my anxiety to, so that when I do go to my congregation, I'm not bringing all of that with me. Do you have any thoughts? So you've said a little bit about that, but just the role of relationships and
Oh,
friendships
yeah.
and those kinds of things. Yeah.
Absolutely. I couldn't agree more with you on that. I mean, most of the help I've received from in my own journey with anxiety has generally happened with people who weren't a part of my immediate, church community, for example.
Mm-hmm.
And that I've had friendships with trusted soul friends who are on a similar journey as me. Maybe they're in a
Yeah.
similar age span as me, and they can understand what it feels like to be 60 something now, navigating some
Mm-hmm.
of what concerns me in my
Mm-hmm.
life, which is different than what concerned me when I was 20 and 30 and 40 something.
Yeah.
So yeah, maybe a lot of the book sounds like our journey with anxiety is a solitary one where we just meet
Mm-hmm.
with God and God helps us, but it's also a journey of community, and
Yeah.
we learn together how to live less
Yeah.
anxiously. And,
Yeah.
and then in that, I think we bring maybe the greatest gift we could bring to our communities of faith is our own journey of learning to live more
Mm-hmm.
non-anxiously. Maybe
Yeah.
that's one of the facets of the gospel that our world most needs right now,
Yeah.
is our own growing non-anxious presence.
Yeah. Yeah. I think other people in some ways also are become like the hands and feet of Jesus to us, right? When
Yes,
God says you don't have to be anxious, you don't have to be scared, when we have people in our lives who not only say that to us, but their presence, right, makes that a reality for us. Oh, I don't have to be at least as scared as I thought I did because I've got this friend, I've got my, husband or wife, I've got my family, I've got whoever. Um, I read Lewis Mead's "Shame and Grace" some time ago, and he has
oh
this
yeah,
great statement. It's a little bit. It's not quite about anxiety, but it's about acceptance or feeling acceptable. He says something like, the way we begin to embrace the reality of our acceptability, like the idea that we're acceptable, is the experience of being accepted by people, right? We start to believe that we're acceptable to God when we have the experience of people accepting us. And so anyway, so in regard to anxiety, I think there's something similar there. The way we begin to believe that I don't have to be anxious about this is when I'm with people in whose presence I feel like, oh yeah, I don't have to be anxious. Does that make sense?
absolutely. No, that makes
Yeah,
perfect sense. Yeah,
yeah.
one of the fun things we got to do this last spring was our own small group in the church we're part of. We walked
Mm-hmm.
through this book together.
Yeah.
So I got to be in a
Mm.
study about anxiety from with a book I wrote, but in a community of people that I walk with, and to be able to
Hmm.
share that experience and to hear their responses and to interact about our real time anxieties,
Yeah.
because there's plenty of them. There's plenty of reasons these days to feel
Yeah.
anxious. There is something about that. To have someone else who's not in the middle of what worries me look at my life and say, I think you're going to be okay.
Yeah. Yeah.
I think you're
Yeah.
going to be okay.
That's right.
So yes, I'm with you. I think the
Mm.
gift of community is a
Yeah.
wonderful
Yeah.
gift.
Yeah. Well, one last question before we wrap up here. You have a section in there about God's joyfulness, and that really
Mm,
resonated with me. And I think maybe sometimes our anxiety comes from the fact that maybe we feel like we're disappointing God. Again, in regard to success as a pastor, should I be doing more? And I have certainly felt that. I sort of went through my own dark night of the soul, which sort of purged me because I experienced the presence of God with me in that. It purged me of a lot of the unhealthy ideas about God. I was guest preaching at a church several years ago, and they had a guest missionary, and I felt so bad for this person because afterwards they came up to me and they kept saying, God must be really disappointed and annoyed with us. Don't you think God is so annoyed with us? And I'm like, no, I don't
oh
think so.
no.
And I was just like, oh, I feel so bad for this person who lives with this idea that God is annoyed with us. And that has not been my experience. I can understand that one would feel anxiety if you believe that God is annoyed, right, at you or at
Yes.
what you're doing. So I love the part about the joy of God. And let's maybe just kind of conclude there. Like, tell us about the joy of God and why that matters so much.
Well, I remember more than once hearing Dallas Willard say, there's no more joyful being in the universe than God.
Mm, mm-hmm.
And I think that's a line that you could chew on for the rest of your life. When
Yeah.
you
Yeah.
when you imagine God looking at you, do you imagine him smiling?
Mm-hmm.
Like, when I see my dad, I only get to see him every once in a while because he lives rather far from me. When I
Yeah.
see him, he smiles.
Hmm.
His first
Yeah.
response is not, "Where have you been?" His first response is, "I'm
Yeah.
so glad you're here."
Yes.
And,
Yeah.
do we believe that God is glad that he chose us
Yeah.
and loves us and likes us? I like somebody talked about shalom is this wonderful combination of joy and peace.
Mm, mm-hmm.
Somehow a blending or a synergy of joy and peace is what shalom
Mm-hmm.
is.
Yeah.
That's what we have in the presence of God. And it's the
Yeah.
kindness of God that leads us to change. It's not a judgmental God. It's not a harsh God. It's not an accusing God. It's love that inspires deep and
Yeah.
lasting transformation. So I think the more we grow to know and rely on the great love and joy of God in our lives, that's the degree to which we will
Yeah.
become who we were meant to be, and we'll be able to change in those ways we want to and that
Yeah.
God's inviting us to. I think
Yeah.
finally, I'll just say I've come to deeply appreciate the language of grace in the New Testament. That God is an empowering presence, that God is a kind and generous presence, that this is his bias. He's a
Mm.
bias for grace toward us.
Mhm.
Um, so those are a few
Yeah.
thoughts that come to mind.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, I love that. Um, yeah, it's so important, and I'm so grateful for this book and just this conversation too. Um, Alan, if people wanted to find out more about you and the work that you're doing, where could they go?
Yeah. Well, the easiest way to find out more about us would be our website at unhurriedliving.com. We have a number of things we offer for free. We have a weekly encouragement email. We've got a podcast with conversations with authors writing similar things and other thoughts related
Cool.
to this core theme for us of hurry, the problem of hurry and the opportunity for
Uh-huh.
unhurry. So again,
And what's the name of the
unhurriedliving.com would
podcast?
be it. The
Oh,
podcast
okay.
is just the Unhurried Living Podcast. You
Great.
could find it
Awesome.
wherever you like listening to them. We've got probably 300 episodes now. It's been there for a
Oh,
while.
that's great. That's great. Awesome. Well, good. Well, good. Well, Alan, thank you so much for being here today. Thanks for this great book that you've written, and just thank you for all the good work that you're doing.
So good to be able to be with you, Marcus.